In this video, we'll demonstrate all the Blazor Bootstrap form components. Form components are all the input elements you would place on a form, like checkboxes, date selectors, range selectors, all the way to standard text boxes and TextArea input elements. To demonstrate these components, we'll create a Blazor Web App. You can choose either server or WebAssembly. There's very little difference in the implementation. Check that the interactive location is set to per page or component. First, we need to install and set up the Bootstrap package. If you browse to docs.blazorbootstrap.com, you'll find instructions under Getting Started, depending on whether your project is a WebAssembly or server app. If you're already familiar with setting up Bootstrap, you can skip to the next section. You can find the different sections in the description below. First, we'll need to install the Blazor Bootstrap package. Then, from the instructions, copy the CSS references and paste them into the head section of your app.razor file. You can also remove any previous references to Bootstrap. Also copy the script references from the instructions and also add them into the app.razor file, just after the web.js reference. Finally, we'll add the service to our program's CS file. And add a using statement to the imports file, so we don't need to repeat it in our page components. To simplify the code, we've created a razor page for every form component we'll be looking at. The home page just contains a list of nav links to these pages. You can get the complete zipped solution folder from the GitHub link in the description below. Going down alphabetically, we'll start with the autocomplete component. As expected, the autocomplete component, as you type, will show you a list of possible answers to choose from. As far as form components go, the autocomplete is probably the trickiest. First, it binds to some field to store what the user types in, but it also needs a type. In this case, the autocomplete field is of type team, which is just a little model with an ID and team name property. The most important part is the data provider, which is some method that would give the element a list of teams to compare to. And then the property name simply says, use this property to do your comparison against. The onChanged event is optional, and we simply use it here to display the result when the content changes. Let's look at that team's data provider method. It's of type autocomplete data provider result and whatever data type you're using. Here we generate a list of teams' records and return it ordered by team name. Of course, as you can imagine, this data could have come from a database table or something. The second form component is the checkbox, which we are all familiar with. Ticking or unticking a box will set that option's value to true or false. It uses the checkbox input element and has a label attribute, which is simply the text that are displayed for that option. We then bind the element's value to a variable in our code section so we can use the result. Here in the HTML, you can see in the div we use the values to display the result to the user. Next is the currency form component. Essentially, this is a numeric input field with a special attribute to determine which currency symbol to use with this input field. The currency input element's first attribute tells it what type of numeric value to expect. This can be int, float, double, or decimal, and corresponds to the variable in your code section. Then we bind the value to the variable. The important attribute is the locale attribute, which tells the currency input element what currency symbol to use in its display. Depending on the currency type, the element will know to either prefix the symbol like with US dollars or postfix the symbol like with the euro in this case. The placeholder attribute is optional and common to all text input components. The date input component provides the user with a date picker or a field to manually enter a date. In its type value, it is common to use a date-only type as opposed to the date and time type. There's a different component we can use specifically for time, as we'll see later in the video. In the code section, we retrieve the current date when the page loads. The number element only accepts numbers. Here we show number fields that only accepts ints, floats, and a field with a minimum and maximum range. The int field only accepts ints. The float field can accept floating point values. The min-max field will display the minimum value by default. If you try to enter anything higher than the maximum, it will default to the maximum. The same when you try to enter a value below the minimum, it will default to the minimum value. The first number input field, we set its type to int so it can only accept integer values and bind it to our int variable in the code section. Since the default value of an int is 0, a 0 will be displayed to the user. For the second example, we made the value type a nullable float. This allows the user to input a float. Now the float's default value is also 0, but since we made it nullable, in other words it can be nothing, the field is initially displayed empty to the user. The last example uses a minimum and maximum input value. To do this, we need to set the enable min-max attribute to true and then specify the minimum and maximum allowable values for this field. Another familiar form component is the password input. It's essentially a text input box that hides what you're typing. It gives the user the ability to view or hide what they're typing. The password input element simply binds to and returns a string value. The radio form component, as expected, behaves like radio buttons. The user can only select one option in the group. Every option will then hold either a true or false value, but there can only be one true option. The radio input element has a name attribute, which is the group name for the set of radio buttons. Every radio element with the same name will behave as part of that group. For its value, it binds a bool variable in the code section. The range component gives the user a slider to select a value. The first example is a simple slider with a badge at the end to show the current selected value. The second example has steps that increment by 10 and display tick marks below it. The user can only select a value that corresponds to a step position. The code for the first example shows a range input element with a type value of int. You may also choose float, double, or decimal if you like. It binds to an int variable and has a min and max attribute to indicate the minimum and maximum values of the slider. Next to the range slider is a badge. While a badge is not really a form input component, we're showing it here anyways, just to visualize the value of the range slider. Technically, a badge is a display component of Bootstrap. It has a badge color and visually hidden text attribute, which is just a description of the badge. Then, of course, the value the badge must display. The second range input example is basically the same, but it also includes the step attribute. This is the step at which the slider can change value. Here we set it to 10 so that the slider must increment or decrement by 10. Next to that is the tick marks attribute. This contains an enumerable list of tick marks. A tick mark has a value property which holds any string value for that specific tick position. It also has a label property, which is the string that will be displayed at that tick position. Next on the list is the switch input component. This is just a different graphical representation of a checkbox. The user can set a selection on or off, which will result in a true or false value for that option. The switch element binds its value to a bool variable in the code section. Its label attribute is used to display next to the switch. The TextArea component allows the user to enter multi-line paragraphs. Its value binds to a string variable in the code section. The rows attribute refers to the display size of the element, not the number of rows the user can type in. The max length attribute determines the number of characters the user can type into the element. Then we get to the most common input component, the text box. In this example, we aligned the text centered. The value of the text input element binds to a string variable in the code section. It has a max length attribute that sets the maximum number of characters the user can enter, and a text alignment attribute, which allows you to set how the text is displayed, either left, right, or center. The final input component is the time component. This allows the user to either enter or select a time. In this example, we've also set a maximum and minimum time value on the element. The time input element has a type value, which would commonly be of type time only. Its value will then bind to a time only variable in the code section. Optionally, you can enable minimum and maximum time values. These time values are also defined by time-only variables in the code section. Thank you for watching our video. For more tutorials on C#, hit subscribe and click the reminder. Give us a like so the video can be visible to more people.